The car came out of nowhere, and Grace Bennett barely had time to jump back before it screeched to a stop, just inches from her legs. Her heart pounded as the door opened and a tall man stepped out, his eyes sharp and unreadable. She recognized him instantly, and her stomach dropped. Daniel Cole. The name alone was enough to make most people in this city lower their eyes and walk the other way. He was the head of the Cole family, a name whispered with fear in every corner of town, and she had almost been hit by his car. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace clutched her bag to her chest, her breath uneven, waiting for him to shout, to blame her, to do something terrible. Instead, he looked at her carefully, as if trying to understand why she was not afraid of him the way everyone else was. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "No," she said, straightening her back despite the fear still running through her. "No thanks to your driver." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. People rarely spoke to him that way. His men shifted uneasily behind him, waiting for a signal, but Daniel raised a hand to stop them before they could move. "You have some nerve," he said, almost impressed. "And you almost ran me over," she replied. "I think I earned the right to be a little upset." He studied her for a long moment, and something about the way she held herself, unshaken and unwilling to back down, stayed with him. Grace worked as a nurse at the small clinic near the edge of town, a clinic that served both sides of the city, including families who were sworn enemies of the Cole name. She had grown up hearing warnings about men like him, about the danger that followed families like his wherever they went. Her own family had old ties to the Bennett name, a family that had clashed with the Coles for years over territory, respect, and pride neither side would let go of. She turned to walk away, expecting that to be the end of it, but his voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned back, arching an eyebrow. "Let me have someone check you over, just to be safe," he said. "It is the least I can do." "I am a nurse," she said. "I can check myself." He almost smiled at that, though he caught himself before it fully formed. "Then let me at least give you a ride home." "I would rather walk," she said, and this time she did not wait for a response before turning and disappearing down the street. Daniel stood there for a while after she left, watching the space where she had been standing. His men exchanged glances, unsure what to make of their boss's silence. Marco, his closest friend and right hand in the family, stepped up beside him. "You know who that is," Marco said quietly. "Grace Bennett. Her family and ours have never been on good terms." "I know exactly who she is," Daniel said, his eyes still fixed on the empty street. "Then you know this is not a road you want to walk down." Daniel did not answer. He simply turned and walked back to the car, his mind replaying the moment she had stood her ground in front of him, unafraid, unwilling to be intimidated. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him like that, like he was simply a man, and not a name to fear. The city itself seemed to hold its breath around moments like these, a place divided long before either of them had been born, split down the middle by old grudges that no one alive could fully explain anymore. Grace had grown up hearing stories about the divide, stories passed down from her parents about territory lost, respect denied, and pride that refused to bend even after decades. She had never questioned those stories as a child, accepting them the way children accept the shape of the world around them, without doubting whether that shape could ever change. That night, Grace could not stop thinking about the encounter either. She told herself it meant nothing, that it was simply a strange moment on an ordinary day, but the image of his calm, searching eyes stayed with her long after she had gone to bed. She reminded herself of everything she had been taught since she was a child. The Cole family was dangerous. Getting close to any of them meant putting herself and her family at risk. She had responsibilities, a job she loved, a brother who depended on her, and a life that did not have room for complications like this. But life, as she would soon learn, rarely listens to the plans people make for it. 2 days later, a car pulled up outside the clinic, just as she was finishing her shift. She recognized it immediately, and her chest tightened. Daniel stepped out, dressed simply, without the usual crowd of men following him. He looked almost ordinary, standing there in the evening light, waiting for her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing around to make sure no one from her side of town was watching. "I needed to see a doctor about an old injury," he said. "This is the closest clinic." She crossed her arms. "You have private doctors." "I know you do." "Maybe I wanted a second opinion," he said, and there was a hint of something warmer in his voice now, something that did not match the reputation that followed him everywhere. "You're lying," she said. "Maybe a little," he admitted. She should have walked away. Every instinct told her to. But there was something about the way he stood there, patient and unwilling to force his way into her space, that made her pause. He was not what she expected. He did not act like a man used to taking whatever he wanted. He waited for her to decide. "5 minutes," she finally said. "That's all you get." He nodded, and they sat together on the bench outside the clinic, as the sky turned orange with the setting sun. Their conversation started stiff and careful, both of them aware of the walls that stood between their worlds. But slowly, the conversation shifted from cautious small talk to something more honest. He told her about the weight of leading a family that expected him to be someone he was not always sure he wanted to be. She told him about the patients she cared for, about the satisfaction of helping people heal in a world that often seemed determined to break them. By the time their 5 minutes had stretched into nearly an hour, neither of them wanted it to end. "I should go," she finally said, glancing at the darkening sky. "Will I see you again?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice held a note of uncertainty, something rare for a man like him. She hesitated. Every warning she had ever received echoed in her mind, telling her to say no, to end this before it became something dangerous. But another part of her, quieter but persistent, wanted to say yes. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This is not simple." "Nothing worth having ever is," he replied. She walked away that night with her mind spinning, torn between the life she had always known and the pull of something entirely unexpected. She told herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, she knew that the moment their eyes had met on that street, something had shifted, something that would not be easy to undo. Daniel drove back to his estate that night, with Marco sitting beside him, silent and watchful. "You're getting involved with someone from the Bennett family," Marco finally said. "Do you understand what that could mean if it becomes known?" "I understand," Daniel said. "Then why are you doing it?" Daniel did not answer right away. He stared out at the passing streets, thinking about the way Grace had looked at him, unafraid and unwilling to be impressed by his name or his power. It had been years since anyone had made him feel like just a man, rather than a symbol of fear and control. "Because for the first time in a long time," he finally said, "I feel like myself around her." Marco shook his head slowly, worry etched across his face. "That kind of feeling can get people killed in this life." "I know," Daniel said quietly, "but I cannot stop thinking about her." Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the ride, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Somewhere across the city, Grace lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a single accidental meeting on a quiet street had managed to turn her entire world upside down, in the space of a single evening. Neither of them could have known, as they lay in their separate homes with their minds full of each other, that this was only the very beginning of a story that would test everything they believed about loyalty, danger, and love. The city around them held old wounds and older rules, rules that said people like them were never supposed to find each other, let alone want to stay. But something had already been set into motion, something neither Daniel nor Grace could easily walk away from now, no matter how much sense it made to try. Grace woke the next morning still thinking of the note tucked away in her drawer, and though she told herself she would not reply, she found herself rereading it twice before leaving for work. At the clinic, she moved through her shift with a strange lightness she could not quite name, smiling at patients a little more easily, humming quietly while she organized supplies. Her co-worker, a cheerful young woman named Isabella who had worked beside her for the past 2 years, noticed the change immediately. "You seem different today," Isabella said, leaning against the counter during a quiet moment between patients. "Do I?" Grace asked, feigning innocence. "You do. Good different. Did something happen?" Grace hesitated, unsure how much to share even with someone she trusted. "Maybe," she admitted. "I'm not sure yet." Isabella grinned, sensing there was more to the story than her friend was willing to reveal. "Well, whoever he is, I hope he treats you the way you deserve." Grace laughed softly, though a flicker of worry crossed her mind at the thought of what Isabella might say if she knew the truth. Some secrets, she realized, were too dangerous to share even with the people closest to her, and the weight of that realization settled quietly over the rest of her day. The days that followed the accident on the street felt different to Grace, though she could not fully explain why. She went through her usual routine at the clinic, checking patients, filling out charts, offering comfort to worried families. Yet a part of her mind kept drifting back to the calm, steady voice of Daniel Cole, and the way he had looked at her as though she mattered more than anyone else in the room. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that a man in his position could not possibly be sincere, but the memory refused to fade. 3 days after their conversation on the bench, a small delivery arrived at the clinic addressed simply to her. Inside was a note, written in careful handwriting, thanking her for the conversation and wishing her well. There was no signature, but she did not need one to know who had sent it. She sat with the note for a long time, before finally folding it and placing it in her bag, unwilling to admit even to herself how much it had meant to receive it. She confided a little in Isabella during a slow afternoon at the clinic, careful to leave out any names or details that might reveal the truth. "I met someone," she said simply. "Someone I probably should not be interested in." "Why not?" Isabella asked, curious. "It's complicated. Our families would not approve." Isabella studied her for a moment before smiling gently. "Families do not always know what is best for us, Grace. Sometimes the heart understands things long before the rest of the world catches up." Grace appreciated her friend's optimism, though she knew Isabella had no idea just how complicated the situation truly was. Still, the encouragement stayed with her, a small comfort she carried quietly through the following days. Her brother, Ethan, noticed the change in her almost immediately. He had always been protective of her, especially after their parents passed, leaving the two of them to rely on each other more than most siblings ever needed to. He watched her hum quietly while cooking dinner one evening, something she had not done in months, and he could not help but ask what had brightened her mood. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just a good day at work." Ethan raised an eyebrow but let it go, not yet suspecting the truth behind her sudden lightness. He had no idea that the source of her distraction was a man whose family name alone could bring danger to their door if their connection was ever discovered. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel found himself equally distracted. He had built a reputation as a man who never let anything interfere with his focus, a leader who kept his emotions locked away where they could not be used against him. But Grace had slipped past every wall he had built, and he found himself thinking about her at the strangest times, during meetings, during quiet moments alone in his office, even in the middle of conversations about matters that should have demanded his full attention. Marco noticed it too, and it worried him more than he let on. He had known Daniel since they were boys, long before either of them understood the full weight of the world they had been born into. He had seen Daniel handle betrayal, loss, and constant danger without ever losing his composure. But this was different. This was something Marco could not protect him from with strength or strategy. Marco remembered a time, years earlier, when Daniel's own father had warned them both about the cost of letting personal feelings interfere with family business. The elder Cole had ruled with an iron discipline, never allowing sentiment to cloud his decisions, and though Daniel had inherited much of his father's steadiness, Marco could see now that he had also inherited a quiet longing his father had never permitted himself to feel. It troubled Marco to watch his closest friend walk toward something so uncertain, yet he also recognized a change in Daniel that he could not entirely dismiss, a warmth that had been missing from him for years. "You cannot keep doing this," Marco said one evening as they reviewed reports in Daniel's office. "If anyone connects you to her, especially anyone from her family or ours, it could unravel everything we have worked to build." "I am aware of the risk," Daniel replied without looking up from the papers in front of him. "Then why continue?" Daniel finally looked up, his expression unusually open for a man who rarely allowed himself to be read so easily. "Because for the first time, someone sees me as more than my last name. I am not willing to give that up so easily." Marco sighed, understanding but still uneasy. He had watched families torn apart by exactly this kind of connection before, and he feared history repeating itself in front of his eyes. Despite the risks, Daniel found reasons to see Grace again. He arranged for a minor injury among his staff to be treated at her clinic, insisting it needed her specific attention. She saw through the excuse immediately but did not turn him away. Their conversations grew longer each time, moving beyond careful pleasantries into deeper territory, discussing childhood memories, dreams they had once held before responsibility reshaped their paths. and fears they rarely admitted to anyone else. Grace began to see a side of Daniel that contradicted everything she had been taught to believe about him. He listened more than he spoke, considered his words carefully, and treated her with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with his reputation. She found herself looking forward to his visits, counting the days between them, and feeling a quiet ache whenever too much time passed without seeing him. One evening, as autumn winds swept through the city streets, Daniel invited her to walk with him along the quiet path near the river, far from the eyes of either family. She hesitated before agreeing, aware of how much trust she was placing in him by stepping into unfamiliar territory, but something about his steady presence made her feel safe, despite everything logic told her. They walked slowly along the water, the city lights reflecting off the surface in shimmering streaks. For a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to exist in each other's company, without the weight of their families pressing down on them. "Can I ask you something?" Grace finally said, breaking the silence. "Of course. Do you ever wish you had chosen a different life? One without all of this?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I did not choose this life. It was given to me before I understood what it meant. But if you are asking whether I wish things were simpler, then yes, more than you know." Grace nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his words more than she expected to. "I used to think people like you never felt trapped by any of it. I thought power meant freedom. Power is its own kind of prison," he said quietly. "You spend so much time protecting everything around you that eventually there is little room left for anything that feels like real freedom." She looked at him then, seeing not the feared boss of the Cole family, but simply a man carrying burdens far heavier than most people could imagine. Something in her chest tightened, a mixture of sympathy and something warmer, something she was not yet ready to name. "I should be terrified of you," she admitted softly. "But you're not," he said, watching her carefully. "No," she said, "I'm not." He reached out then, gently taking her hand, and she did not pull away. They stood together by the river as the last light of evening faded into night, both of them fully aware that whatever was growing between them defied every rule they had been raised to follow. But the world around them was not so easily ignored. Word had already begun to spread quietly through certain circles, rumors of the Cole boss being seen with a woman connected to the Bennett name. It reached Marco first, delivered by a nervous informant who feared what the consequences might be if the news reached the wrong ears. Marco knew he needed to warn Daniel immediately, though he also understood that warnings rarely stopped a man once his heart had already made its decision. At the same time, whispers reached Grace's side of the city as well. Her brother's closest friend, a man who worked closely with the Bennett family's inner circle, mentioned hearing something about the Cole boss frequenting a certain clinic more often than necessary. Ethan brushed it off at first, unwilling to believe his sister could be connected to something so dangerous, but a seed of doubt had already been planted, one that would soon grow into something far more difficult to ignore. Grace remained unaware of how quickly the rumors were spreading, too caught up in the quiet joy of discovering someone who made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. She continued meeting Daniel in secret, each encounter deepening the connection between them, despite the danger surrounding every stolen moment they shared. On another evening that week, Grace introduced Daniel to a small part of her world he had never seen before, taking him to a modest gathering at a friend's home, where ordinary people spent their evening laughing over simple food and old stories, entirely unaware of who he truly was. He watched quietly at first, unused to rooms where no one deferred to him, where conversation flowed freely without calculation or fear. By the end of the night, he found himself laughing more freely than he had in years, drawn into a game of cards with strangers, who had no idea that the man sitting among them controlled half the city's shadows. "You looked happy tonight," Grace said afterward, as they walked slowly toward the quiet street where his car waited out of sight. "I cannot remember the last time I felt so ordinary," he admitted. "It was good." "You could have more of that," she said gently, "if you wanted it." He considered her words carefully, turning them over in his mind long after they had parted ways that night, wondering if the life he had always assumed was fixed and unchangeable might hold more possibility than he had ever allowed himself to believe. One night, after another quiet meeting near the edge of the city, Daniel walked her back toward her neighborhood, staying carefully out of sight of anyone who might recognize him. As they reached the corner near her home, he stopped and turned to face her. I know this is complicated, he said. I know the risk we are both taking, but I do not regret a single moment of this. Neither do I, she said softly, though a flicker of fear crossed her expression as she thought about what might happen if their families discovered the truth. Whatever happens, he said, reaching for her hand once more, I will protect you. That is not something I say lightly. She believed him, though a part of her worried that even a man as powerful as Daniel Cole might not be able to protect her from the storm that could come if their secret unraveled. Still, in that moment, standing beneath the dim glow of a streetlight with his hand wrapped gently around hers, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, their story could defy the odds stacked against it. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street, someone who had been quietly tracking Daniel's movements for reasons of his own. The information gathered that night would soon find its way into hands eager to use it, setting into motion a chain of events neither Grace nor Daniel could yet imagine. Events that would test the fragile bond they had built and force both of them to confront just how far they were willing to go, to protect something the world around them insisted could never survive. For now, though, they walked away from each other that night with hearts lighter than they had felt in years, unaware of the storm quietly gathering on the horizon, a storm that would soon arrive and demand everything from both of them. The following weeks passed in a delicate balance of secrecy and growing closeness, each stolen meeting between Grace and Daniel adding another thread to a bond neither of them could deny any longer. Yet with every meeting, the risk of discovery grew heavier, pressing down on both of them like a weight neither could fully escape. Marco had grown increasingly restless, watching Daniel slip further into a connection that threatened everything the Cole family had built over generations. He understood loyalty, understood love even, but he also understood the brutal realities of the world they lived in, a world where enemies waited patiently for any sign of weakness. He decided it was time to speak more directly, no longer content with subtle warnings that seemed to fall on deaf ears. There are people asking questions, Marco said one afternoon, finding Daniel alone in his study, about where you go in the evenings, about who you have been seen with. Daniel's expression remained calm, though something tightened behind his eyes. Who is asking? Does it matter? If word reaches the wrong people, it will not just be you at risk, it will be her too, and possibly her entire family. Daniel set down the papers he had been reviewing, his jaw tightening. I have been careful. Careful is not enough in this life, Marco said firmly. You know that better than anyone. The conversation left Daniel unsettled for the rest of the day, forcing him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. His feelings for Grace had grown far beyond a simple curiosity or fleeting attraction. He cared for her deeply, more than he had cared for anyone in years, yet that same care now placed her directly in the path of danger she had never asked for. That evening, he arranged to meet her earlier than usual, choosing a quiet spot far from the areas either family frequented. When she arrived, she immediately sensed the tension in his posture, the careful distance in his eyes that had not been there before. What's wrong? She asked. He hesitated before answering. People are starting to notice us. Her stomach tightened. How bad is it? Bad enough that I need you to be more careful, he said. Bad enough that I am starting to wonder if continuing this puts you in more danger than I am willing to accept. Grace felt a flash of fear, not for herself, but at the thought of losing what they had built together. Are you saying we should stop? I am saying I need you to understand the risk clearly, without illusion, he said. If our families discover this, it will not simply be disapproval. It could mean real danger, for both of us, and for the people we love. She swallowed hard, thinking of her brother, of the life she had built for herself, and of the man standing before her who had somehow become impossible to imagine her life without. I understand the risk, she said quietly. I have understood it from the beginning, but I am not willing to walk away simply because it is dangerous. Daniel studied her closely, searching for any sign of doubt, but found none. Her resolve mirrored his own, and it only deepened his admiration for her. Then we move forward carefully, he said finally. But we move forward. She nodded, relief and determination mixing together in her chest. Their relationship, however, could not remain hidden forever. Ethan had grown more suspicious over the following days, noticing his sister's frequent late evenings and the careful way she avoided answering questions about where she had been. One night, Unable to ignore his concerns any longer, he confronted her directly. "Where do you keep disappearing to?" he asked, arms crossed as she walked through the door later than usual. "I told you. I've been picking up extra shifts," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Grace, I'm not a fool. Something is going on, and I want to know what it is." She hesitated, torn between honesty and the instinct to protect the fragile happiness she had found. Finally, she sighed, deciding that continuing to lie to her brother would only make things worse. "I've been seeing someone," she admitted. "Who?" She hesitated again, knowing the reaction his name would provoke. "Daniel Cole." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Ethan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger in the span of a few seconds. "Are you serious? Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the history between our families?" "I understand it better than you think," she said firmly. "But he is not what everyone assumes him to be." "That does not matter," Ethan snapped. "His family and ours have never been on the same side. If anyone finds out, it will not just be dangerous for you. It could put all of us at risk." "I know the risk," she said, echoing the same words she had spoken to Daniel only nights before. "But I am not willing to give this up, simply because it is complicated." Ethan stared at her, torn between his instinct to protect her and his understanding that she was no longer a child he could simply order around. "This is a mistake, Grace." "Maybe," she admitted, "but it is my mistake to make." He shook his head, frustration evident, but he did not push further that night, sensing that any additional pressure would only push her further away. Still, the seed of worry had been planted deeply within him, and he found himself watching her more closely in the days that followed, uncertain of what to do with the dangerous truth she had shared. Meanwhile, within the Cole family, rumors continued to circulate quietly among certain members, particularly those who had long harbored resentment toward Daniel's leadership. One man in particular, a distant relative named Victor Lane, saw the situation as an opportunity rather than a concern. Victor had long believed he deserved more influence within the family than Daniel had ever granted him, and news of Daniel's connection to a Bennett family member offered exactly the kind of leverage he had been waiting for. Victor had spent years watching Daniel rise through the family ranks, with a quiet resentment he rarely allowed anyone to see. He believed himself equally capable of leading, perhaps even more capable, since he had never let personal weakness distract him from the discipline the position demanded. He remembered every slight, real or imagined, every decision Daniel had made that Victor privately disagreed with, and he had waited patiently for the right opportunity to prove himself the better choice. News of Grace Bennett had arrived like a gift he had not dared hope for. Victor began quietly gathering information, careful not to reveal his intentions to anyone who might warn Daniel of his growing scheme. He understood that exposing the relationship publicly could destabilize Daniel's authority within the family, creating an opening for Victor to position himself as a more decisive, less distracted leader in the eyes of those who valued tradition above all else. As autumn deepened into the colder months, Grace and Daniel continued meeting whenever they could, their bond growing stronger despite the tension surrounding them. They found comfort in small moments, quiet dinners in secluded locations, long conversations that stretched late into the night, and the simple pleasure of being understood by someone who did not see them through the lens of family expectation or old rivalries. One evening, as they sat together in a quiet cafe far from the areas either family controlled, Daniel reached across the table and took her hand gently. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to build a life beyond all of this. A life where we did not have to hide." Grace's heart quickened at his words. "Is that even possible for someone like you?" "I do not know," he admitted honestly, "but I am starting to believe it might be worth trying to find out." She smiled softly, allowing herself, if only for a moment, to imagine a future unburdened by the shadows of their family's history. It was a fragile hope, but one that had begun to feel less impossible with each passing day they spent together. Yet even as they allowed themselves to dream, the danger surrounding them continued to grow closer, quietly gathering strength in the shadows, waiting for the moment it would finally break through the careful walls they had built to protect what they had found. Victor's plans moved steadily forward. Ethan's worry deepened with each passing day, and within the Cole family, more eyes began turning toward Daniel's increasingly frequent absences. Neither Grace nor Daniel could have known just how quickly their fragile happiness was about to be tested, nor how deeply the coming days would challenge everything they believed about love, loyalty, and the courage required to hold on to something the world seemed determined to tear apart. The weeks that followed brought a strange mixture of joy and quiet dread into Grace's life. Every stolen evening with Daniel felt like a gift, yet every parting left her with a lingering unease she could not fully explain. She had grown accustomed to watching over her shoulder, to choosing her words carefully around her brother, and to feeling the weight of secrecy pressing down on her more heavily with each passing day. Ethan, for his part, had not let go of his concerns, despite his sister's insistence that she understood the risks involved. He found himself watching the streets more carefully, listening more closely to conversations among his family's associates, searching for any sign that the secret Grace carried might have already begun to spread beyond the two of them. He had not shared her secret with anyone else, not yet, but the weight of holding it alone had begun to wear on him. Within the Cole family, Victor Lane continued his quiet campaign, carefully building a case against Daniel's leadership. He gathered small pieces of information, observations from loyal associates, and whispered conversations overheard in hallways, slowly assembling evidence of Daniel's relationship with Grace. He understood that exposing the truth too early might backfire, allowing Daniel time to control the narrative before it could damage him. Instead, Victor waited patiently, choosing his moment carefully, determined to ensure maximum impact when the truth finally emerged. Daniel, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the depth of Victor's scheming, though Marco's warnings continued to weigh on him. He had grown more cautious in recent weeks, taking greater care to avoid being seen with Grace in public, choosing meeting locations far from familiar territory, and limiting the number of people who knew about their relationship. Yet despite his caution, he could not shake the feeling that time was running short, that the secret they had protected so carefully would not remain hidden much longer. One evening, as Grace finished her shift at the clinic, she noticed a man she did not recognize watching her from across the street. He did not approach her, but something about his presence unsettled her deeply. She hurried home, glancing over her shoulder several times, relief washing over her only once she reached the safety of her own front door. She mentioned the encounter to Daniel the next time they met, and his expression darkened immediately. "Describe him," he said. She did her best, though her description was vague, colored by the fear she had felt in the moment. Daniel listened carefully, his mind already working through the possibilities. He suspected someone within his own family might be behind the surveillance, though he could not yet confirm his suspicions. "I want you to be extra careful," he said. "If anyone approaches you, anyone at all, do not engage. Come straight to me. You're scaring me," she admitted. "I need you to be cautious, not scared," he said gently, though the tension in his voice betrayed his own growing concern. That night, Daniel returned to his estate and immediately called Marco into his study. "Someone has been watching Grace," he said without preamble. Marco's expression tightened. "I warned you this would happen." "I know," Daniel said. "I need you to find out who is behind it." Marco nodded, already turning his mind toward the task, though a part of him feared he already knew the answer. He had noticed Victor's increasingly frequent absences, his hushed conversations with certain associates, and his subtle attempts to gather information about Daniel's personal affairs. He did not yet have proof, but his instincts told him Victor was involved. Over the following days, Marco worked quietly to uncover the truth, careful not to alert Victor to his suspicions. He spoke with trusted associates, reviewed recent movements within the family, and slowly began to piece together a picture that confirmed his fears. Victor had indeed been gathering information, preparing to use it against Daniel, at the moment it would cause the most damage. When Marco finally brought the evidence to Daniel, the weight of the situation settled heavily over both of them. "He's planning to expose the relationship," Marco said, "probably in front of the family council, where it will do the most damage to your authority." Daniel's jaw tightened, anger and fear mixing together in his chest, though he kept his expression carefully controlled. "When? I don't know exactly," Marco admitted, "but soon from what I can tell." Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, weighing his options. He could confront Victor directly, though doing so might only accelerate his plans. He could attempt to control the narrative himself, choosing to reveal the relationship on his own terms before Victor had the chance. Or he could try to protect Grace by stepping back from the relationship entirely, though the thought of losing her filled him with a dread he had not expected to feel so strongly. He knew, deep down, that stepping away was not truly an option, not anymore. Whatever came next, he was determined to face it directly, rather than allow Victor to control the outcome. The following evening, he met with Grace, choosing his words carefully, as he explained the situation. "There is a real chance this becomes public soon," he said. "Sooner than either of us expected." Grace's heart sank, fear tightening her chest. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we need to prepare," he said. "For whatever reaction follows, from my family, from yours, from everyone who has ever believed we should never have crossed paths." She nodded slowly, trying to steady herself against the wave of anxiety threatening to overwhelm her. "Are you ready for that?" "I am ready to face it," he said, taking her hands gently in his, "as long as you are still willing to face it with me." "I am," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I just worry about what it will cost." "I know," he said softly. "I worry too, but I would rather face the consequences honestly than continue hiding something I no longer wish to hide." His words offered some comfort, though the uncertainty of what lay ahead continued to weigh heavily on both of them. They spent the remainder of the evening together, holding on to the quiet peace of each other's company, aware that such simple moments might soon become far more difficult to find. Meanwhile, Ethan's suspicions had grown sharper, fueled by rumors beginning to circulate quietly among the Bennett family's associates. He had heard whispers, vague but unsettling, hinting that his sister's connection to the Cole family was no longer entirely secret. Panic gripped him as he considered the potential consequences, not just for Grace, but for their entire family should the rumors reach the wrong ears. He confronted Grace again, this time with far greater urgency than before. "People are talking," he said, "about you and him. It's not just a secret anymore." Grace's stomach twisted with anxiety. "How much do they know?" "I don't know exactly, but enough that I'm worried," he said. "You need to end this, Grace, before it puts everyone in danger." "I can't just end it," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's not that simple anymore." "It has to be that simple," Ethan insisted. "This isn't just about you and your feelings. This affects our whole family." Grace felt torn between her love for Daniel and her responsibility to protect her family, a conflict that left her feeling as though she were being pulled apart from every direction. She did not have an answer for her brother that night, only a heavy uncertainty that followed her long after their conversation ended. As the days passed, the pressure surrounding both Grace and Daniel continued to build, each of them bracing for the moment when the secret they had protected so carefully would finally break into the open, forcing them to confront not only their families, but the full weight of what their connection truly meant. Whatever came next, both of them understood that the quiet, careful world they had built together was about to change forever, and neither of them could predict exactly how it would end. In the days leading up to that evening, Daniel had sensed a shift in the atmosphere around him, a subtle coldness from certain members of his household staff, a hesitation in the eyes of associates who had always greeted him without pause. He mentioned it to Marco, who admitted he had noticed it too, though neither of them yet understood the full extent of what was coming. "Something is building," Daniel said one afternoon, staring out the window of his study. "I can feel it." "Victor has been quiet," Marco said. "Too quiet. That usually means he is close to making his move." Daniel considered calling a private meeting to address the rumors directly, to control the narrative before Victor had the chance. But before he could act, an urgent summons arrived, calling every senior member of the family to an emergency council session that same evening. Daniel understood immediately that Victor had chosen his moment, and that whatever was about to happen would unfold entirely on Victor's terms rather than his own. The truth finally broke into the open on a cold evening during a gathering of the Cole Family Council, a meeting Daniel had not expected to become the turning point of everything he had worked to protect. Victor Lane stood before the assembled members, his expression carefully composed, though a quiet satisfaction lingered beneath the surface, as he prepared to reveal what he had been gathering for weeks. "There is something the family needs to know," Victor announced, his voice carrying across the room. "Something concerning our leader's judgment." Daniel's expression remained calm, though his pulse quickened as he sensed exactly where the conversation was heading. "Daniel has been involved with a woman from the Bennett family," Victor continued, letting the words settle heavily over the room. Gasps and murmurs spread instantly among the gathered members, disbelief and anger mixing together in equal measure. "Is this true?" one of the older members asked, turning toward Daniel directly. Daniel did not flinch. "It is true." The room erupted into chaos, voices rising over one another, accusations of betrayal and recklessness filling the air. Marco stood close beside Daniel, ready to intervene if the situation grew too volatile, though he understood that words alone would not be enough to calm the storm that had just been unleashed. "You have put this entire family at risk," one member shouted. "For a woman from a family that has opposed us for generations." "I have not put anyone at risk," Daniel said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "I have simply refused to let old hatred dictate every decision I make." "That old hatred exists for a reason," Victor interjected, seizing the opportunity to further undermine Daniel's authority. "Your judgment has clearly been compromised. Perhaps it is time this family considered new leadership." The accusation hung heavily in the air, and Daniel understood immediately the full scope of Victor's intentions. This had never simply been about exposing his relationship with Grace. It had always been about using it as a weapon to seize control of the family for himself. "You would tear this family apart over a personal matter," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the storm surrounding him, "while ignoring the fact that under my leadership, we have maintained stability and prosperity this family has not seen in years." Some members nodded in quiet agreement, though others remained visibly shaken by the revelation, their trust in Daniel's judgment clearly rattled. The meeting continued for hours, filled with heated debate and uncertainty, until it was finally decided that a formal vote would determine whether Daniel remained in his position of leadership. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, reaching Grace far sooner than Daniel had hoped. She learned of it through a hurried message from Marco, warning her to remain indoors and avoid any unnecessary risks until the situation stabilized. Fear gripped her as she processed the news, understanding immediately the danger that now surrounded both of them. At the same time, news of the confrontation reached the Bennett family as well, spreading through their circles with alarming speed. Ethan, already anxious about the rumors he had heard, felt his worst fears confirmed. He rushed to find Grace, panic evident in his expression, as he burst through the door of their home. "You need to tell me everything," he said, "right now." Grace, shaken and exhausted, finally revealed the full truth of her relationship with Daniel, the months of secrecy, the depth of her feelings, and the danger now surrounding them both. Ethan listened in stunned silence, torn between anger and fear for his sister's safety. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said finally. "Now the whole family knows, and it puts all of us in danger." "I understand the risk," Grace said, tears filling her eyes. "But I cannot simply pretend none of this ever happened." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, urgent and unexpected. Ethan answered cautiously, finding one of his family's associates standing outside, his expression grim. "There's trouble," the man said. "Word has spread that Daniel Cole's leadership is being challenged. Some are saying this could create an opportunity for us, a chance to weaken the Cole family from within." Ethan's stomach twisted at the implication. "What kind of opportunity?" "There are those within our family who believe this is the perfect moment to strike, to take advantage of the division within the Cole ranks." Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the full weight of the situation. Not only had her relationship with Daniel destabilized his family, it now threatened to reignite the very conflict between their families that they had both hoped to leave behind. "We need to stop this," she said urgently, "before it turns into something neither side can undo." "How exactly do you propose we do that?" Ethan asked, frustration evident in his voice. "You started this, Grace. Now it's spinning out of control." She did not have an immediate answer, but she knew she could not simply stand by while the situation escalated further. She needed to see Daniel, needed to understand exactly what he intended to do next, and needed to find some way to prevent the fragile peace between their families from collapsing entirely. Slipping out of the house despite her brother's protests, she made her way toward the Cole estate, her heart pounding with every step. She arrived to find the atmosphere tense, guards more alert than usual, the weight of recent events evident in the careful watchfulness surrounding the property. She was allowed entry after a brief hesitation, likely due to Marco's intervention, and found Daniel standing alone in his study, exhaustion etched across his features. "You should not have come here," he said immediately upon seeing her. It's too dangerous right now. I needed to see you, she said. I needed to know you're all right. I'm managing, he said, though the strain in his voice suggested otherwise. The council is voting on my leadership. Victor has used this situation exactly as I feared he would. This is my fault, she said, guilt washing over her. No, Daniel said firmly, closing the distance between them. This is not your fault. This is the result of old hatred and old fears that existed long before either of us was born. Victor would have found another way to challenge me eventually. You simply gave him an opportunity he had already been searching for. Grace shook her head, though his words offered little comfort. What happens if you lose the vote? Daniel hesitated before answering, the weight of the question settling heavily between them. Then everything changes. My position, my influence, possibly even my ability to protect you. Fear gripped her chest at his words, though she refused to let it show. Then we need to find a way to make sure that does not happen. There may not be much either of us can do at this point, he admitted. The decision now rests with the council. Their conversation was interrupted by Marco, who entered the study with urgency written across his face. The vote is happening now. They're waiting for you. Daniel took a steadying breath, turning to Grace one final time before leaving. Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that being with you has been worth every risk we have taken. She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. Whatever happens, I am not going anywhere. He nodded, drawing strength from her words, before following Marco out of the study, to face the council that now held the fate of his leadership, and perhaps the fate of their relationship, firmly in their hands. As Grace waited anxiously in a quiet room nearby, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily upon her. The sounds of muffled voices from the council chamber, offering no clear indication of which direction the decision might fall. She thought of her brother, of the fragile peace between their families now hanging by a thread, and of the man she had come to love despite every warning she had ever received. Whatever the outcome of the vote, she understood clearly now that there was no turning back from the path she had chosen. The only question that remained was whether the fragile bond she and Daniel had built together would be strong enough to survive the storm now threatening to consume everything around them. Before the vote began, one of the eldest members of the council, a quiet woman named Margaret who had served the family for over 40 years, rose to speak. Her voice, though soft, carried great weight in the room, for she had known Daniel since he was a boy and had earned the respect of every generation she had served. I have watched this family survive wars, fought over pride, over territory, over grudges so old that most of us have forgotten how they began, she said. I have also watched good leaders lose everything because they let fear guide their decisions instead of wisdom. Daniel has led us through difficult years with a steady hand. I do not believe a matter of the heart erases the judgment he has shown in matters of business and protection. I ask this council to consider carefully what kind of family we wish to be before casting a vote we cannot undo. Her words settled over the room, quieting some of the anger that had filled it only moments before. Victor's jaw tightened, sensing the tide shifting away from him, though he said nothing, unwilling to challenge a woman so widely respected. The council chamber fell silent as the final votes were cast, each member's decision carrying the weight of generations of tradition and expectation. Daniel stood at the center of the room, his expression calm despite the uncertainty churning beneath the surface. Marco stood close beside him, ready to offer support in whatever form the outcome required. Victor watched from across the room, confidence evident in his posture, certain that his careful campaign had succeeded in turning enough of the council against Daniel's leadership. Yet as the votes were tallied, a flicker of doubt began to creep into his expression, the numbers not aligning quite as neatly as he had anticipated. When the final count was announced, a narrow but clear majority had chosen to retain Daniel as the head of the family, a decision that stunned Victor and left him scrambling to understand where his plan had failed. Several older members, respected voices within the council, had spoken in Daniel's defense, citing years of stable leadership and prosperity that outweighed their concerns about his personal choices. Relief washed over Daniel. Though the victory felt fragile, the division within the family still evident, despite the outcome of the vote. He understood that Victor's ambitions had not been fully extinguished, merely delayed, and that careful vigilance would be required to prevent further attempts to undermine his position. Grace, waiting anxiously nearby, felt overwhelming relief when Marco finally emerged to share the news. She rushed to find Daniel, embracing him tightly the moment she saw him, gratitude and love mixing together in the tears that finally spilled from her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. "Not entirely," Daniel admitted honestly, "but we have won this battle, at least." Their relief, however, was short-lived. Word soon reached them that tensions within the Bennett family had escalated significantly, certain members pushing for retaliation against the Cole family, viewing the recent turmoil as an opportunity to reclaim territory and respect they believed had been unfairly taken from them over the years. Ethan found himself caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to his family and his growing understanding that further conflict would only lead to greater loss on both sides. He sought out Grace once again, urgency evident in his expression. "Some of our people are talking about taking action against the Coles, using this situation as justification." Grace felt her chest tighten with fear. "That cannot happen. It will destroy everything. On both sides." "I know," Ethan said, "but convincing them to stand down will not be easy." Grace turned to Daniel, desperation evident in her voice. "We need to find a way to stop this before it goes any further." Daniel nodded, already turning his mind toward possible solutions. "Perhaps it is time both families sat down together, openly, rather than allowing rumors and assumptions to dictate our actions." The suggestion, though bold, offered a glimmer of hope amid the tension surrounding them. Arranging such a meeting would not be simple, given the deep mistrust between both families, but it represented a possible path forward, one that might finally begin to heal wounds that had festered for far too long. Over the following days, careful negotiations began, facilitated by trusted intermediaries, willing to risk their own reputations in pursuit of peace. Ethan, despite his earlier reservations, found himself advocating cautiously for dialogue rather than retaliation, recognizing that continued conflict would only bring further suffering to people on both sides. Finally, a meeting was arranged, a tense gathering held in neutral territory, both families represented by their most senior members. Daniel and Grace stood together, prepared to face whatever judgment awaited them, determined to advocate for a future free from the hatred that had defined both families for generations. The meeting began with cautious hostility, old grievances surfacing quickly as both sides struggled to set aside decades of distrust. Yet as the conversation continued, guided carefully by Daniel's calm insistence on mutual respect and Ethan's quiet support for reconciliation, something began to shift within the room. Grace spoke eventually, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I understand the history between our families. I understand the pain and mistrust that has shaped so many decisions over the years, but continuing this cycle only ensures more suffering for everyone involved. I am not asking anyone to forget the past. I am simply asking that we consider a different future." Her words, heartfelt and sincere, resonated with several members of both families who had grown weary of ongoing conflict. Slowly, cautiously, the conversation shifted from accusation toward tentative possibility, both sides recognizing that continued hostility served no one's true interests. By the end of the meeting, no formal alliance had been established, but a fragile agreement had been reached, an understanding that further retaliation would not be pursued, and that both families would allow space for the relationship between Daniel and Grace to exist without immediate threat of violence. It was not a perfect resolution, nor a guarantee of lasting peace, but it represented something neither family had achieved in generations, a willingness to consider a different path forward. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to settle into a new, more open rhythm for Daniel and Grace. They no longer needed to hide their relationship, though careful diplomacy remained necessary to maintain the fragile peace they had helped create. Victor, weakened by the failed attempt to seize control, gradually lost influence within the family, his ambitions checked by Daniel's renewed strength of leadership and the loyalty of those who had witnessed his integrity throughout the crisis. Ethan, though still cautious, found himself slowly accepting the bond between his sister and Daniel, recognizing the sincerity and courage both had shown throughout the ordeal. Their relationship, born from an accidental encounter on a quiet street, had somehow become the catalyst for change neither family had thought possible. One evening, months after the turmoil had finally settled, Daniel and Grace stood together once again along the quiet path near the river, where their bond had first deepened. The city lights shimmered softly across the water, and for the first time, neither of them felt the need to glance over their shoulders. worried about who might be watching. "We did something no one thought possible," Grace said softly, leaning against him. "We simply refused to accept that hatred was the only option," Daniel replied, wrapping his arm gently around her. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. "The peace between our families?" "I think it will take continued effort," he admitted honestly, "but I believe it is possible, especially with people like your brother, willing to choose understanding over old grudges." Grace smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the water flow steadily beneath the glowing city lights. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the future, she understood now that they had already faced the impossible together and emerged stronger for it. Their story, born from danger and forbidden circumstance, had become something far greater than either of them had ever imagined, proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by courage, honesty, and a love strong enough to defy every expectation placed upon it. As the night deepened around them, Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression filled with quiet certainty. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you." "Then let's face it together," Grace said, her voice steady with newfound confidence. "Starting today, and every day after this one." And as the city lights continued to shimmer softly around them, two people who were never supposed to find each other stood together, unwilling to let go of the love that had brought them this far, ready to build a future neither family had ever thought possible. In the months that followed, small signs of change began to appear throughout the city. Members of the Bennett and Cole families, once forbidden from even acknowledging one another on the street, began exchanging cautious greetings, then careful conversations, then, in time, genuine cooperation on matters that benefited both sides. Ethan, who had once feared his sister's choice would bring ruin upon them all, found himself surprised by how naturally the walls between the two families began to soften, once both sides chose to set aside old fear in favor of open dialogue. Isabella, still unaware of the full truth for some time, eventually learned who Grace's mysterious companion had been, and rather than judgment, she offered only warmth and quiet admiration for the courage her friend had shown. Margaret, too, continued to advocate for patience and understanding whenever old tensions threatened to resurface, becoming an unlikely bridge between two families who had spent generations refusing to see each other as anything other than enemies. Daniel's leadership grew stronger in the aftermath of the crisis, not weaker, for those who had once doubted his judgment came to see the loyalty and steadiness he had shown throughout the ordeal as proof of exactly the kind of leader the family needed. Victor, stripped of much of his influence, eventually left the city altogether, unable to reclaim the standing he had once hoped to seize. Grace continued her work at the clinic, though now without the need to hide the truth of her life from those around her. She often thought back to the evening of the accident, to the man who had stepped out of that car with sharp eyes and a calm voice, and marveled at how a single unexpected moment had reshaped not only her own life, but the lives of two families who had spent far too long defined by hatred rather than hope. On a quiet afternoon nearly a year after that first meeting, Daniel found her again outside the clinic, waiting exactly where he had waited the very first time he had come looking for her. This time, there was no need for excuses, no need for careful glances over their shoulders. "I have something to ask you," he said, and something in his voice made her heart skip. She turned to face him fully, curiosity and warmth lighting her expression. "What is it?" He reached for her hand, steady and certain in a way that spoke of everything they had endured together. "Build a life with me, openly, completely. No more hiding. No more waiting for the world to decide whether we are allowed to be happy." Grace felt tears gather in her eyes, though this time they were tears of joy rather than fear. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, of course." And there, on the same street where danger had first brought them together, they stood in the open daylight, unafraid, surrounded by a city, slowly learning to let go of its oldest wounds, ready to write the next chapter of a love story that had refused, against every expectation, to be forbidden any longer.